I used to think the silence meant I was safe. That as long as I didn't cause trouble, as long as I stayed out of the way, kept my room clean, and never let my report card fall below perfection, I'd earned my place. Like I'd paid rent for my existence with good behavior and extra chores. I was Elara, the quiet one, the observer, the girl who learned early to bite her tongue until it bled just to keep peace in a house where peace was already a fragile illusion. Our house in the suburbs was one of those places people might drive past and think, now there's a nice, stable family. White trim, a lilac bush in the front yard, bicycles tipped sideways in the grass. Mom worked part-time at the library. Dad was a mid-level manager who never forgot to mow the lawn. Dinner was always at 6, even if it was just reheated lasagna or grilled cheese with soup. On paper, nothing was wrong. But underneath that well-oiled routine lay a quiet brutality, one that never raised a hand but still managed to leave bruises. It all started when Lila was born. She came into the world 2 months early with lungs too small, a heart that beat like a bird's, and skin that bruised just from being touched. I was 5 then. I remember the day clearly because it was the first time I was told I was a big girl now and needed to understand that things had changed. And they had. Overnight. My mother cried in corners and whispered to doctors. My father transformed into a walking shadow, moving between work and hospital rooms like he was living someone else's life. And me, I disappeared. Not literally. I was still there, still brushing my own hair and packing my own lunch for kindergarten, but their eyes no longer found me. Their voices rarely addressed me, except to ask me to lower the volume on my cartoons or fetch another blanket from the hallway closet. The spotlight had shifted, and it never came back. They said Lila was a miracle, and I didn't disagree. She survived pneumonia before her first birthday, endured 3 surgeries by the time she was 2, and still smiled with the brightness of someone who had never been told her body was trying to betray her. I loved her, I did. But love didn't keep the loneliness away. Love didn't stop the slow erasure of my place in their world. What made it worse was how good I was at not needing anything. Even as a child, I seemed to instinctively understand that asking for more than they had to give would only make them love me less. So I stopped asking. I stopped expecting. I became the easy one, the self-sufficient child, the daughter who didn't demand attention, who didn't cry when birthdays were forgotten or when she got the flu and still made her own soup. I excelled in school. Straight A's every year, student of the month 5 times, spelling bee winner, art contest finalist, you name it. And every certificate I brought home was quietly filed into a kitchen drawer, never hung on the fridge, never praised aloud. Once, I remember hearing my father on the phone saying, "Elara? Oh, she's good. Doesn't give us any trouble." And I remember thinking how that was all I ever was to him, a child who didn't give him trouble. Meanwhile, Lila's every fever was treated like a crisis. Every smile she managed was met with applause. Her artwork, even the crayon scribbles that looked like spaghetti in a blender, were taped up on the fridge like masterpieces. When she coughed, Mom called the doctor. When I sprained my wrist at recess and came home with a cast, they barely looked up from the dinner table. But here's the real cruelty: Lila didn't ask for any of this. She didn't choose the sickness that tethered our family's love to her body like an 4 drip. And yet, as she got older, I saw it in her eyes, the resentment. The deep-rooted belief that I was the golden child, the healthy one, the one who could run and breathe and do anything without collapsing. She saw my silence as smugness, my good grades as a way of showing her up, my independence as a personal slight. She didn't see that I was just trying to survive. We coexisted like opposing magnets, close but never connected. In public, we smiled. In private, we navigated each other like landmines. And then came that day. The day that rewired my entire nervous system. It was spring, the air full of pollen and possibility. I had just turned 12. My English teacher, Mrs. Hartley, had pulled me aside after class and told me I'd won the regional essay competition. Not just from our school, out of the entire county. My piece, a fictional letter from Anne Frank to her future self, had moved the judges to tears. They were going to present the award at a formal ceremony downtown. It was the kind of moment any child dreams of. I ran home, my backpack bouncing, heart pounding, rehearsing how I would tell them. I imagined Dad's proud smile, Mom's teary eyes. I thought, maybe this time, they'll see me. Really see me. But when I opened the front door, the house was chaotic. Mom was packing a duffel bag. Dad was on the phone with the insurance company. Lila sat on the couch, pale and sweating, clutching her stomach. She needs to see the specialist in Denver, Mom said before I could get a word out. We're driving overnight. Elara, there's pizza money on the counter. Be good, okay? And just like that, they were gone. I sat in that silent kitchen with my award letter in hand, the words blurring under the weight of unshed tears. I didn't eat the pizza. I didn't turn on the TV. I just sat there for hours, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the echo of my own breath. They missed the ceremony. They missed me. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I whispered it to myself like a prayer, like a curse. I don't matter here. And in that moment, I believed it. By the time I turned 14, I had perfected the art of vanishing while remaining completely visible. I wasn't the ghost who lingered in doorways or cried in the corners of school dances. I was the kind of invisible you become when everyone assumes you're fine without ever asking. I smiled when spoken to, nodded at the right moments, kept my sleeves unwrinkled, my voice gentle, and my rebellion internal. I didn't drink. I didn't sneak out. I didn't shout at my parents or dye my hair black or slam my bedroom door. No, I just slowly became less of a daughter and more of a concept, dependable, independent, unproblematic. Meanwhile, Lila had learned how to make even the air bend around her. Her health stabilized after 13, no more weekly specialist appointments, no emergency room scares, no urgent whispers in the night. She still had her condition, yes, but the panic had passed. What remained was the residue, the kind of fragile resentment that calcifies in silence and grows teeth. The house no longer felt like a hospice ward. It felt like a courtroom, and Lila was both the star witness and the victim on the stand. She wore her bitterness like a badge, quiet around adults, venomous when it was just the two of us. I tried to connect with her, I did. I told myself maybe, now that she wasn't tethered to machines or locked in a cycle of coughing and collapse, we could start again. Maybe we could be what sisters were supposed to be, not mirrors, but companions. I offered to help her study. I loaned her my favorite hoodie during a storm. I even skipped a school event once just to take her to a used bookstore downtown because she mentioned liking the smell of old pages. But every gesture I made was mistaken for performance. You just do this to make yourself look good, she snapped once, holding a paper I helped her edit. You can't help showing off, can you? I remember standing there, holding a mug of hot tea I made her, chamomile, the kind she liked, and realizing that no amount of kindness could cross the border she had built between us. Her face was blank, but her words were a blade. Every syllable carved a line between us that had nothing to do with truth and everything to do with perception. In her mind, I wasn't her sister. I was her rival. And worse, I was winning. The tragedy was, she had no idea I never wanted to compete. I just wanted to be seen. But when you grow up in a house built on quiet endurance, you learn quickly that being misunderstood is safer than being pitted. So I nodded, set the mug down gently beside her desk, and walked away without responding. It was easier than arguing, easier than proving a negative, easier than admitting how much it hurt to be hated for trying. Things worsened slowly, like a leak in a roof you pretend isn't there. Mom started forgetting I was even in the room. Dad only asked questions when it involved logistics, rides, groceries, appointments. Conversations that used to be filled with cautious warmth were now transactions. And Lila? She grew bolder with every passing week, testing boundaries like a scientist looking for cracks in a glass beaker. Sometimes she would whisper things just loud enough for me to hear. She thinks she's so special. I bet she cries when no one's looking. She only gets good grades because she's desperate for attention. I ignored them. At least I told myself I did. But the truth was harder to swallow. The things she said had started sounding like echoes of my own internal monologue. That summer, I made a decision that would finally break the glass we'd all been pretending wasn't cracking. There was a summer program offered through my literature teacher's college alma mater, an intensive 2-month workshop in southern France, focused on narrative writing, historical fiction, and French language immersion. It was everything I had dreamed of since the 8th grade. And it was fully funded for students with financial need. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't tell Lila. I applied in secret, filling out essays and mailing recommendation letters from my favorite teachers on afternoons when the house was empty. I used the public library's scanner so nothing could be traced to the printer at home. I didn't lie maliciously. I just knew, deep down, that if I asked, they would say no. Not because they hated me, but because they were tired, and because Lila would find a reason to make it about her, and because they had spent so long not investing in me that the idea of supporting my future would feel foreign, maybe even threatening. So I mailed the application with shaking hands and a whisper of hope I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. 3 weeks later, I got in. The acceptance letter came in a thick envelope with my name written in gold ink across the front. I held it in my hands for a full hour before opening it, sitting on the floor of my closet with the door shut, breathing through my mouth because I was afraid I would scream if I let the joy come out all at once. It was mine. For the first time in my life, something that mattered was mine alone. But like all fragile things in this house, it didn't stay hidden for long. I came home one afternoon to find Lila sitting on my bed, holding the envelope, her face twisted in that same pinched expression she wore when she used to cry about needles and blood tests. Her eyes were rimmed with red, but there were no tears, just rage held barely beneath the surface. "You really thought you could hide this?" she hissed, holding up the letter like it was evidence of a crime. "I was going to tell you," I said carefully, stepping forward with palms raised like I was approaching a wild animal. "Bullshit," she snapped. "You didn't say anything because you knew it was selfish. You were going to run off to France and leave us here. You were going to abandon me." That word, abandon, hit me harder than I expected. I had spent a decade doing everything I could not to make waves. I stayed when no one noticed, helped when no one asked, and folded myself so small I barely recognized the girl in the mirror anymore. And now, when I had finally chosen something for myself, that choice was labeled betrayal. "You don't need me," I said softly. "You have them. You've always had them." Her face twisted. "You think that just because I was sick, I had everything handed to me? You think I wanted any of this?" "No," I whispered, voice trembling. "But you never once looked at me and wondered what it felt like to be erased." There was a pause, just long enough for me to believe maybe she'd heard me. Then she screamed, a raw, aching sound that made the walls feel thinner. "Why don't you just disappear?" And the worst part was, I almost apologized. Almost. I heard the door slam downstairs. Footsteps. Our mother's voice, tired and sharp. "What is going on?" I waited for someone to ask me what happened. I waited for someone to look at me. But when I explained, when I held out the letter with shaking hands and tried to explain why I hadn't told anyone, my parents didn't ask about the program, didn't ask how long I'd been planning, didn't ask what it meant to me. They turned to Lila. "Are you okay?" Mom asked gently. "She's been under a lot of stress," Dad added. And then, the words that cracked whatever was left of me. "Elara," Mom said slowly, "just apologize. It's not worth the drama." I looked at her for a long time, searching her face for any sign of the woman who used to sing lullabies and tell me stories about the stars. I didn't find her. "I'm not sorry," I said, voice cold, calm, and final. I packed my bag that night. Not out of spite. Not as a tantrum. Just as a choice, a quiet, necessary choice to stop bleeding for people who didn't notice I was cut. I left behind my trophies, my old journals, The books Lila used to borrow without asking. I took only what I needed. As I walked down the driveway, I didn't cry. I didn't look back. No one followed me. No one called. And as the porch light flickered off behind me, I understood something no child should have to understand. You can survive without love, but it changes the shape of your soul. The first night in my apartment, I slept on the floor with my hoodie rolled into a pillow and the smell of unfamiliar dust clinging to every breath I took. There were no pictures on the wall, no warmth in the beige drywall, no one waiting for me to say goodnight or ask how my day had gone. But there was silence, and it wasn't laced with tension or weaponized disappointment or the kind of cold that pretends to be concern. It was just quiet. Pure, unpolluted quiet. And for the first time in years, I let myself cry without shame. College wasn't the escape I thought it would be. It was more like being airdropped into a different kind of wilderness, one with more books and fewer family obligations, but no map, no compass. Just long hallways, shared kitchens that always smelled faintly like burnt eggs, and roommates who asked too many questions and offered too much friendliness for someone like me. I enrolled in psychology because it felt like the only field that might explain the jagged mess I'd dragged with me. Not just my family, not just Lila, but me. The way I flinched when people raised their voices, even if they were just excited. The way I hesitated before asking for help, even with something as small as a classmate's notes or directions to the registrar's office. I didn't want to become a therapist. I wanted to dissect the machinery of dysfunction until it stopped feeling like fate and started looking like a solvable equation. Every lecture felt like a mirror, some days too cracked to recognize, other days so clear it hurt to look into. I studied attachment theory like it was scripture, underlined sentences about enmeshment and emotional neglect until the pages curled at the edges. I memorized terms like parentification and self-silencing. I wrote essays about how unmet needs calcify into self-sabotage and how trauma doesn't need to be violent to leave bruises that never fade. I told myself it was academic, analytical, clinical, but deep down, I knew I was studying myself like a case file no one else had bothered to open. I didn't date. I didn't party. I didn't invite anyone over, even when the semester ended and everyone else was passing around invitations like confetti. I was polite always. Cordial, never cold. But distant, intentionally, methodically distant. I gave just enough to be liked, but never enough to be known. My phone stayed silent by design. I blocked their numbers, all of them, my parents, Lila, even the landline from the house I used to call home. I didn't delete the emails, though. I read every one, usually late at night, sitting cross-legged on my mattress with the blue light casting ghosts on the walls. My mother's messages always started with hope and ended with guilt. "We miss you, sweetheart," evolved into, "I don't understand what we did to deserve this." Dad's messages were rare, short, and emotionally constipated. "Hope you're okay. Car's due for oil change." As if mentioning maintenance somehow counted as parenting. Lila's emails were unpredictable. Some were venomous. "You were always the selfish one. You just did it better." Others were startlingly soft. I saw this quote and it made me think of you. Once she sent me a voice memo, just 30 seconds of her playing a piano melody we used to hum as kids. I listened to it. I didn't reply. And for a long time, I told myself that was healing. But healing, it turns out, is a lot messier than silence and boundaries and deleting birthdays from your calendar. Healing, when done honestly, starts to scrape at the edges of your armor, asking if you're protecting yourself or just hiding. And nothing, absolutely nothing, brings those questions to the surface, like someone trying to love you anyway. Her name was Sasha. She was a second-year transfer who sat next to me in behavioral psychology and wore oversized sweaters and combat boots like armor against the world. She smelled like eucalyptus and vanilla. The first time she spoke to me, she asked if I'd like to grab a coffee after class, not as a date, not as a test, just as a moment of shared breath outside the sterile university air. I almost said no. My mouth even formed the shape of it. But something in her eyes, steady, unflinching, made me pause. We sat on a bench near the student union with cheap cappuccinos and wind chapping our lips, and she told me about growing up in a house with 5 younger siblings and 2 absent parents. She told it like a story she had practiced, with jokes and dramatic pauses and sarcasm sharp enough to keep people from seeing how much it had hurt her. I listened. Not because I wanted to, but because some buried part of me needed to know I wasn't alone in the ruin. We started studying together. Slowly, methodically, our lives braided around each other like vines growing through the same broken fence. Sasha never pushed. She never demanded. But she noticed everything. The way I flinched when her fingers brushed mine reaching for a notebook. The way I changed the subject anytime someone brought up parents or childhood or holidays. The way I always walked home alone, no matter how late it got. "Do you ever let anyone in?" she asked me one night, eyes soft but unrelenting. I shrugged. Letting people in gives them a map. And people with maps find places to burn. She laughed, not because it was funny, but because she understood. But even people who understand have their limits. It started when her dad left. Not for the first time, but this time it was permanent. No note, no call, just an empty bank account and a voicemail that said, "I can't do this anymore." She spiraled. Not dramatically, not like a TV meltdown, but slowly, like a leak under a floorboard you don't notice until your whole house smells like mold. She stopped showering, stopped eating, canceled class for a week, and showed up at my apartment with a trembling lip and a single sentence. I didn't know where else to go. I let her in. Of course I did. But as the days passed and she leaned heavier and heavier into my space, something in me started to fracture. She needed too much, not in volume, but in depth. She needed me to hold space for her grief, for her abandonment, for her rage and confusion and helplessness. She curled up in my bed, clung to me in sleep, texted every hour like my presence was the only thing keeping her from floating away. And for a while I gave it. I made tea. I listened. I held her. Until I couldn't. One night, she cried for 2 hours about a voicemail from her mother, angry, accusatory, manipulative. I tried to soothe her. I really did. But all I could hear was Lila's voice from years ago. "Why don't you just disappear?" And suddenly, I couldn't breathe. "Sasha," I snapped, sharper than I meant, "I'm not your therapist." Her face twisted. "I didn't ask you to be." "Then stop needing me like one," I said, quieter, but no softer. The silence between us thickened, like fog curling between tombstones. She stood, grabbed her bag, and left. No slam. No scream. Just gone. And I collapsed. Not in tears, not in regret, but in something worse. Shame. Because the truth was brutal. I had pushed her away not because she was too much, but because she reminded me of who I used to be, fragile, needy, invisible in a different way. And I hated that girl. I had spent years burying her, cleaning up her messes, pretending she didn't still live inside me. I sat on my kitchen floor for hours, knees pulled to my chest, staring at the cracks in the tile like they held the answer to a question I hadn't dared ask. Had I become the very cold I was running from? The next day, I sent Sasha a message. Not an apology, not yet. Just 3 words. "I'm still here." She didn't reply for 2 days. When she did, it wasn't a forgiveness parade. It was a picture of a flower growing through concrete and a single sentence. "I don't need you perfect. I just need you honest." I cried then not because I was sad, but because no one had ever offered me that kind of grace before. And slowly, we rebuilt. Not to what we were before, something better. Not codependent. Not invulnerable. Just 2 people trying to heal beside each other, without making healing a competition or a burden. It was the first time I realized that emotional independence isn't about locking the door. It's about learning which doors are safe to open and which ones you have to walk through alone. It was 4:08 a.m. when my phone started buzzing against the nightstand. a tremor in the dark that fractured the silence like a fault line snapping under pressure. The first vibration I ignored. Half asleep, half frozen, curled under 3 layers of blankets in my apartment where the radiator always made promises it couldn't keep. I was used to dreams that tasted like memory and nightmares that bled like flashbacks. Cold was no longer a temperature. It was a state of being. The second vibration came 13 seconds later, longer this time, desperate. Then came a third, a fourth. By the time I reached for it, bleary-eyed and full of dread, there were 14 missed calls blinking across the screen like an emergency flare I hadn't asked for. 3 were from the house number I hadn't saved, but never deleted. 2 were from my mother's cell, a number I used to know by heart, now just a string of digits I recognized in my spine more than my mind. 8 were from my father. 1 from an unknown. I didn't want to listen to the voicemail. I didn't want to know what part of me would crack open if I did. But that voice, that ancient voice inside me that had grown up being overlooked and still wanted to be wanted, hit play anyway. The message was short, gravel-voiced and rushed, like it had been recorded in a panic. Elara. It's Dad. She's in the hospital. It's Lila. They don't know if she's going to. He paused, swallowed hard. Please come. That was it. No explanation. No apologies. Just the ghost of everything I'd buried reaching for my throat. I sat there for 27 minutes, unmoving, staring at the blinking voicemail icon like it was counting down the seconds until I had to make a decision. This wasn't the first time I'd gotten a call in the night. Emergencies, accidents, ex-lovers with sudden clarity. But this was different. This wasn't about them. This was about the house I left but never fully escaped. I didn't pack quickly. Every piece of clothing I pulled from my dresser felt like a negotiation. Warm enough for waiting rooms, clean enough for judgment. I brushed my teeth like I was rehearsing for confrontation, not hygiene. When I zipped my coat, it sounded like closing a chapter 1 thought I'd already rewritten. I didn't go out of guilt. I need you to understand that. I went because ghosts don't stay buried. And some hauntings need to be confronted, not escaped. The train station was barely awake. The vending machines blinked with mechanical disinterest. I bought a black coffee that tasted like burnt apologies and found a seat by the window where I wouldn't have to look at anyone. The train came at 5:47 a.m., right on time, as if the universe had decided not to give me an excuse to turn back. I took a window seat. And the memories came with me. They didn't knock. They didn't whisper. They just sat down beside me, uninvited, unashamed, unhealed. I remembered Lila's 9th birthday, the way she looked at me when I handed her a handmade necklace I'd spent 2 weeks crafting from beads and thread. She had unwrapped it slowly, eyes darting toward our mother, who was already filming with a camera that never pointed my way. "It's fine," she had said, and handed it off to the side table like it was already forgotten. I remembered the time she fell asleep in my bed when we were 13 and 15, her head on my shoulder after our parents fought about money again. She had been sniffling all night and refused to say why. I didn't ask. I just let her stay. She never mentioned it again. Neither did I. I remembered the first time she told someone I made her feel small, and how I spent days afterward trying to find every moment that might have looked like cruelty, even if it was just silence. By the time we reached the halfway point of the train ride, the landscape outside had turned from city gray to suburb soft, the kind of houses with porches and secrets and too many rooms for people who don't talk. The hospital was off the main highway, perched on a hill like a fortress. Clean. Sterile. Nothing like home. Yet somehow it felt exactly like the place I was always running from. The woman at the front desk didn't recognize my last name. That was a gift. I gave her Lila's. Her eyes softened, her hands fluttered. "Room 319, she said, with that voice nurses use when they don't want to tell you how bad it really is. I took the stairs. I needed the burn in my legs to distract from the burn in my chest. Room 319 smelled like antiseptic and the end of something precious. My father stood by the window, hunched in a way that didn't belong to him, like life had peeled his spine into a question mark. My mother sat in the corner chair, clutching her purse like a lifeline. Her hair was thinner, her hands more fragile. Lila lay in the bed, pale, still, tubes where conversation should have been. Machines breathing for her because she couldn't. She looked small. So small I almost didn't recognize the girl who once told me to disappear. My mother looked up first. Her mouth fell open, not in relief, not in joy, but in the stunned silence of someone who thought the door they slammed shut would never creak open again. "Elara," she said. Just the name. No preamble. No welcome. My father turned next. His face cracked. "You came." I nodded. Because what else do you say when you're standing at the edge of the grave you didn't dig, but still feel responsible for? No one rushed to hug me. No one cried out my name in dramatic reunion. And strangely, I was grateful for that. I sat in the hard plastic chair beside the bed, staring at the face of the girl who shaped so much of my silence. And I waited. Waited for the moment when I would know what to say. It didn't come. Instead, my mother whispered, "She asked for you," before they sedated her. I didn't flinch. I didn't react. Because what do you do with that kind of sentence? What do you do when someone you thought hated you, someone who sharpened every edge you ever had, asks for you at the end? "She's sick," my father said. Really sick. Liver failure. Complications. We didn't know until it was too late. I nodded again. Because nodding was safe. And then, in the hush of the room, something shifted. "We didn't know how to love you both," my mother said. Not dramatically. Not apologetically. Just, plainly. I turned to her, heart pounding like I was 12 again, standing alone in an auditorium while they missed my ceremony. "I didn't know how to ask," I said. My voice was dry. Honest. No one cried. No hugs. No cinematic music playing in the background. Just 3 broken people sitting in a too-cold room beside a 4th who might not wake up. Sometimes healing doesn't come with closure. Sometimes it comes with the choice to stay in the room, even when everything inside you wants to run. And I stayed. That night, I slept in the chair beside her bed. My fingers inches from hers. Not touching. Not yet. But closer than I'd ever dared to be before. The morning after Lila opened her eyes, I sat in the hospital cafeteria, staring into a paper cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The windows were fogged from the shift between night and morning, that in-between hour when the world hasn't quite decided what it wants to be. Outside, frost clung to the corners of the bench I had paced hours earlier, waiting for the worst that never came. Inside, the hum of vending machines and the low murmur of nurses' shoes scraping vinyl tile filled the silence I had grown uncomfortably used to. Lila had spoken, barely above a whisper. Just a few words. And somehow, they cracked more ice than all the years of rage and silence between us ever could. "I thought you wouldn't come," she had said, voice thin, breath weak, but unmistakably hers. "I almost didn't," I had replied. Not cruel. Just honest. The kind of honesty that finally feels like release rather than rebellion. She didn't cry. I didn't either. But something passed between us in that sterile room with its beeping machines and paper-thin blankets. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but a fragile kind of acknowledgement. The kind that doesn't pretend to fix everything, but makes it impossible to keep pretending it was never broken. Now, in the cafeteria, I watched steam rise from the tray of eggs I hadn't touched and thought about what healing really looks like. It isn't loud. It isn't grand. It's a cup of coffee at dawn, hands wrapped around the warmth, breath catching every time your mind tries to go back. My parents had gone home that morning. They needed rest, they said. But I think they needed distance, not from Lila's sickness, but from everything that had unfolded in that quiet room when no one had the energy to lie anymore. I didn't blame them. Not anymore. Not because I excused what had happened. Not the years of neglect. Not the blind loyalty to one child while the other folded herself smaller and smaller until she vanished. but because now, after everything, I finally saw the full picture. They hadn't been villains. They had been tired, overwhelmed, human. They had made choices from fear, not cruelty. They had loved the way they knew how, and that way had been flawed, incomplete, but never entirely absent. I finished the coffee even though it tasted like regret, and walked back to the waiting room outside the ICU. Lila's room had been moved. She was stable enough for observation, no longer monitored every 5 minutes. When I entered, she was sitting up slightly, a book open in her lap, something a nurse must have left behind. Her hair was a mess of flattened curls, and her skin still had that pale translucence that reminded me too much of our childhood. But her eyes were different. Not sharp. Not defensive. Just tired. Like mine. "Did Mom call?" she asked, her voice steadier now, but still low. I shook my head. Probably sleeping. "Dad too." Lila nodded slowly. "Figures." We sat there for a while. No one said anything for so long the clock on the wall became a metronome for everything unspoken. Then, finally, I exhaled. "You made me the villain," I said, not as an accusation, but as a fact I had needed to name aloud. She didn't deny it. She didn't justify it. "I know," she whispered. But it was easier than admitting I hated being the center of everything. I turned toward her slowly, not trusting what I'd heard. She didn't look at me, just stared at the corner of the room where the paint was peeling, as if the truth was easier to aim at when you didn't have to look it in the eye. "They made everything about me," she continued, but not in a way that felt like love. More like pressure. Like I couldn't fail. Like if I did, it would break them. "You weren't supposed to carry that," I said softly. "And you weren't supposed to disappear," she said back. We both laughed, not because it was funny, but because it hurt less than crying. That was the start. Not a reconciliation. Not a reunion with fireworks or tearful apologies. Just two girls, grown now, sitting in a sterile room, finally saying the things they should have said years ago. Over the next few days, I stayed. Not because I had to. Because I wanted to. Because sometimes healing isn't the moment someone says they're sorry, it's when you realize you've stopped needing them to. Our parents visited more often once Lila was out of danger. They brought soup and magazines and quiet apologies disguised as questions. "Do you need anything? Can I get you more pillows?" I didn't press them. I didn't lash out. I let them fumble. Because sometimes people trying awkwardly is more powerful than people pretending nothing happened. On the 4th morning, my mother asked me to come downstairs to the hospital cafe. We sat near the window, our reflections ghosted into the glass by the morning sun. She stirred her tea for far too long before speaking. "I read your essays," she said suddenly. "The ones you published. Your school kept sending alumni updates." I blinked, stunned. I hadn't known she even subscribed. "You never said anything," I managed. "I didn't know if I was allowed," she whispered. And there it was, the chasm of years finally bridged by the admission neither of us had been willing to speak. "I used to think you didn't care," I said, the words trembling more than I wanted them to. "I used to think you didn't need me," she replied. We didn't cry. We just sat there, hands wrapped around paper cups, breathing the same air for the first time in what felt like decades. By the end of the week, Lila was discharged. I took the train back that evening, watching the same trees blur past the window, but this time something felt different. Lighter. Not fixed. Not perfect. But lighter. The apartment felt colder than usual when I unlocked the door, but not in the way it used to, not like abandonment. More like quietness that waited to be filled. I dropped my bag. I peeled off my coat. I stood in the center of the living room and let myself just exist. Not Elara the strong one. Not Elara the self-erased. Not Elara the disappointment or the savior. Just Elara. Just me. And then, as if the universe needed punctuation, my phone lit up. One call. Not from my mother. Not from my father. From Lila. My thumb hovered for a moment. Then I answered. "Hey," I said softly. "Hey," she echoed. I just Wanted to say I'm glad you came. I'm glad I did too, I said, truth weaving itself around every syllable. We didn't talk long. We didn't need to. Some things are not meant to be rushed. Some things, after all, are stitched slowly, one word, one breath, one fragile choice at a time. Later that night, as I curled into bed with the city humming outside my window, I let myself think about the years ahead. Not in fantasies. Not in dread. Just, honestly, I wouldn't forget what happened. The scars were real, but they didn't sting anymore. They didn't define me. They were woven in, part of the tapestry, not the whole of it. And as I drifted into sleep, I knew something with quiet certainty. You don't heal by erasing the past. You heal by facing it and choosing not to repeat it.